So thank you, folks. We're going to get rolling here with the next session, which is called Gathering Up. And I wanted to go back and reiterate one thing, is that the arc of the day here, we started off with a look backwards into the history. We're moving now in this session and the one that will follow immediately after lunch into looking at some activities in the present in our sector, and then we end the day with a panel of artists that are going to be addressing some possibilities for the future. So I just wanted to put that back on people's agenda here, which is sort of the big picture. This session we're going to be reporting and talking a little bit about GIA's research work that's been going on for the last year and a half here, and then also solicit some input and some direction, continued direction from you folks in the room. Let me introduce our panel. We have Alan Brown from Wolf Brown, who many of you may already know, Claudia Bach from Advise Arts in Seattle, and also with us, but not at the table, is John Carnwath. If you'd stand up, John, and wave to the people. Who's also on our research team, working for Wolf Brown. I'm Tomer Peterson, the program director at Grantmakers in the Arts. Thank you, Vicki. I was interested to note when we started off, and I assume most of you are aware of our research initiative, and many of you have participated in the focus groups and interviews that we've done. But I thought when Holly put up her timeline here of activities and sort of benchmarks and external factors, wouldn't it be wonderful if we had the data and the information for all of those years on what the volumes and what the numbers for support for individual artists were, and we could track that in relationship to the external forces. And we don't, maybe someday we will. We will see. I wanted to start off with just the very first question, since we do have new people in the room, is why did GIA undertake this initiative? And we have had this group and your predecessors, who are the supporters of individual artists, meeting at our conferences now for 25 years. And this is a major constituency of funders within our organization. And it really was in response to many of you who are probably in the room, raising the question of, since we put the effort and time into doing research and tracking funding to institutions, why didn't we do that same work for individuals? That was a conversation that has been occurring for a long time, and we actually sort of decided to put our nose to the grindstone and see if this couldn't be done. And that's really what we're going to talk about a little bit today. I'm going to introduce this with just a couple of big points. Alan and Claudia then are going to go into more of the nitty-gritty details. But the very start is we're really looking at this kind of research as an inquiry. This really is an investigation. We started off with some assumptions about what we would do, and one was that it really was going to be based on the work that we've done with the Foundation Center that really tracked data on actual awards and was counting dollars. And that has really evolved here over the last year. And we're looking at that data, and I'm going to quote Alan here, that the importance of that kind of information is not the numbers and the report itself, but it really is the kind of conversations and the communications and the potential for improving our practice that comes out of that information is really the goal. That's really what we're looking for, not necessarily just the numbers. So I have just a couple points. The first big point is that this is new territory for many funders of individuals. It was interesting, actually, when we were doing the fundraising for this work, that funders and institutions that worked in other areas, and particularly some of the large funders who had programs other than arts, were already working in a data-driven environment, and their staffs were more conversant and more used to the idea of looking at research than many of the programs that funded solely individuals or any of the programs that just funded solely in the arts. So we're kind of at a turning point. Funders' use of data and information is changing. This is an evolving field. We're running into this whole big data concept everywhere we turn these days, so we're in the midst of some sort of an evolution. The second point, and this is something we already know but was proved by the interviews and by the discussion, is among the funders of individual artists, there is no consensus in the room. You are all working on a common thread and with many common goals, but the nature of the programs and the way the work is being done is way more diverse and way more varied than I would have ever imagined. And I've been working with this group at GIA now for 10 years. And it also is evolving. It's a very complex ecology. And one of the things, as we have discussed earlier, it was necessary to look at the effort to start to collect data to have some common definitions. And really, the exceptions were more prevalent than the commonalities among the way people are working and the vocabulary that you're using to describe your work. And I can give you a couple examples here that came up. We had discussions about re-granting and the use of intermediaries. And we had people tell us, well, that's kind of a cop-out. Funders should be doing that work themselves, that we shouldn't be encouraging that. And we had others telling us that, no, the use of intermediaries is the only way I can reach the communities that need this support, that it would be arrogant for the foundation to presume that they could understand the various cultural communities within their state or within their geography, that the intermediaries actually were their partners and a great source of information there. So there's a broad range of interests. I have to look back at the notes here. We met last year at this pre-conference and discussed this with many of you. And at the time, the response was to be expansive. The message back from the crowd, many of you were in the crowd, was be sure to include this, be sure to include that. We've got to include academic programs. And the idea grew and grew to the point that we almost got frightened off that this was even going to be possible. The next point here is the sector may not be ready for this work. And I mean that in the best possible way. When we began this investigation, it really was with an assumption that data about actual awards was what we were after, was that counting money was really the center of this kind of benchmarking research. And one of the things that's unfolded over time is that in order to do that work, we needed to have a much better understanding of the motivations and the methodologies and the tools that funders were using, that the context that that work was being done in was more important than the amounts. It really was the why and the how that really overshadowed the how much in all of that. So as we worked in developing this taxonomy, and many of you saw this, it was also, a link was emailed to you before the pre-conference, and we have hard copies if people want to take a look at it. It emerged that we really needed, in addition to looking at grant awards, we really needed to look in terms of benchmarking research on information about the funding source, about the funders themselves, about the organizations, and we needed to look at gathering data on the program or programs. And it turns out many funders have more than one program or more than one way they're actually doing this kind of work. And that those two modules grew in importance and are probably the first places that this work will really begin as we move forward in the next couple of years. And it will be that data and that information, which we can also benchmark over time, that will provide the structure to begin gathering the information on awards themselves. So that's a little bit of a shift from where we started this work out. You're looking at me like a little bit of a shift. I was looking at, what is he saying? It actually is a major shift. And we're not abandoning, we think, as we move forward. And this also, I'm not announcing a decision here. I'm just announcing sort of which way the wind is blowing. As I say, this research is really an investigation. And so as we've moved through time, it's playing itself out different than I think that we imagined in the beginning. So we're not abandoning the idea of benchmarking, of tracking benchmark data over time. But the way that's going to roll out is probably different than the discussion we were having at this time last year when we were in Miami. This taxonomy, as those of you who looked at it, is complex and maybe a bit academic. And that really is all a reflection of what you all told us. That the programs were really varied, that there were all these nuances, that it wasn't just a check that goes to artists, that sometimes comes along with educational components, with training, with residency opportunities. All of these things are mixed up and provided in any number of different combinations by all of you and by other supporters in the room. So the last point is about what's next. As I said, we're not announcing a decision or a change here. One of the things we have learned in this first step is there was really a lot of energy and discussion around intermediaries and re-granting. This topic, which was sort of appeared on the side, actually moved into the center of many of these conversations. And there's a slight shift of focus. We're hoping to actually, let me back up because I'm getting ahead of my own self here. Doing research to provide benchmarking data is a long-term project. And one of the things we heard from people was that there was an interest and a need in gaining some more immediate traction and some immediate information. And as the subject of re-granting and intermediaries started growing in people's attention, we realized that was probably the first place we could actually provide some product back out of this research initiative. And so our goal is to present something and publish something on that subject early in 2014. So whether that's an independent publication, a web project, or issue of the Reader is yet to be determined. But that will be one of the first major outcomes here of this work. So many of you heard me say earlier that we were doing this work not to help you in the job, but to help your successor. We've actually changed our tune a little bit, and we hope to have something back that folks in the room can actually make use of. We appreciate all of the people who spent time doing interviews and filling out papers and discussing this with us on the phone. There's been a great amount of support and information back from funders, and as well as those of you that have actually financially supported the research work. So I'm going to turn this over to Alan and Claudia, and we'll back around for questions and things when we get to the end. Thanks.
Thanks, Tomer, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be here again. It's been quite a journey since last year. There are still days when I think we're all insane to be even trying to do this because of the complexities and the ambiguities and the definitional challenges against sort of standardizing data elements. Last year, those of you who were tracking on this, that we did, Claudia and I and Tomer, an exploratory analysis of kind of what is the plausibility, what is the feasibility of actually trying to institute some sort of a longitudinal tracking system. And some of you may remember our egg diagram from last year. I don't know if you remember that. We were just trying to wrap our minds around this ecology of artist support and what's inside the egg and what's outside the egg in terms of what we can track or what is of interest in some of the key dimensions of artist support, monetary, non-monetary, unrestricted, restricted, and kind of what distinctions do we care about, do we want to preserve. You may also remember this ball of yarn diagram where we were just trying to understand the flow of the money, and how do intermediaries come into the system, and where can we actually measure the exchange of resources between artists and funders. So after a Luftpause, when Tomer went out and got funding for this, we kind of re-engaged, actually just a few months ago, and really set out in earnest to develop a taxonomy. John Carnwath has been instrumental in that. We've had 4 minds on this. And a draft was created and rolled out, and we've been in the business of vetting it for the last kind of month and a half. And I just want to say that please be assured that we are very much doing everything we can to build on existing work in this vein. We're very much in regular contact with NASA, the National Assembly of States Arts Agencies, and the New York Foundation for the Arts, and the Foundation Center, existing aggregators of data, to make sure that whatever we would design would have a clear relationship to their taxonomies so that data could be shared in the future. We circulated a draft. It is dense. It's certain to put you to sound asleep if you look at it too late in the day. But 20 of you were brave enough to actually get into it and read it, and I have to thank you the quality of the feedback we received from you was very, very high and provoked us and propelled us to a new place, really, and that just happened in the last month. The taxonomy is a work in progress, and I just, this is sort of a crude diagram, but it's the diagram I want to share with you now. Don't worry, this is the only slide I'm going to show you. That we are, in conceptualizing the taxonomy, we're really thinking in 3 layers. And one is sort of, who are you as an organization? And you'll notice there's a branch. There's 3 levels here: program level and award recipient level. Because most of you think about your grants in terms of programs, sort of veins of support. And you have names for those programs sometimes, and there are intentions underlying those programs that vary from funder to funder. So the 3 level, and then there's the award recipient level, which of course would be information about individual awardees or recipients. At the program level, there's a branch. Many of you make grants to intermediaries who then will go on and provide support to artists, either monetary or non-monetary. And as Tomer mentioned, this has come to the fore. So in the design of our taxonomy, we wanted to make sure that we capture that. Now, at that level, all we would ask you is, who are your intermediaries? How much do you give them, and for what purpose? Then you'll see there's a loop back to the top. Then we would, theoretically go to those intermediaries and say, okay, now tell us about your programs. And we accept and understand that there's a breakdown in information between when you grant money to intermediaries and what they spend, because they're able to access other resources, and it's kind of impossible to fully understand that link. But it's a critical part of the taxonomy. On the left-hand side is the program info. Tell us about your programs to support individual artists, both monetary and non-monetary. And then, if possible, tell us about who actually was receiving that money. So at each level, there are a number of questions. Not everyone has programs. Some of you are small foundations, and everything you do is supporting individual artists, so it's not per se a program. But that program level is really where we would get sort of basic information about money. And I have to say, this whole notion of intention has come to the fore. Is really, what are you hoping to accomplish with this grant money? And developing a way of categorizing intentions has been a major focus of our work, so that you could feel like you're able to tell the story of your grant programs through this taxonomy. Now, you'll never be able to fully tell the story because so much of it is qualitative. But that's sort of where we've been going with that. So that's the very high level framework for this taxonomy. And we've come to understand in speaking with many of you that, that it's impossible for you, it would be impossible for one reason or another, logistically, morally, ethically, to actually implement this taxonomy, because for one reason or other, many of you are uninterested in asking artists about their personal demographics or other things. And we understand that, but it's also occurred to us that the taxonomy itself may have value apart from what gets implemented in a longitudinal field-wide benchmarking study. In other words, the development of standards, some of you actually have said to us, we don't have standards, we need standards. And parts of the taxonomy may be helpful to others of you. So that is really, as far as I want to take it right now, I'd like to ask Claudia now to give you a summary of the feedback we've heard from you all over the last month and a half.
Thanks, Alan. So I want to echo the thank you to all the people in this room and those who aren't here who were willing to have these complex conversations, sometimes circuitous with us, but who really shared a lot of very useful information. We really heard some of those topics really arise again, and especially at the end of this morning's panel, because it relates to how people want to see this kind of information influence the future in the field. So people were extraordinarily candid, for which we thank you, and it was very helpful. And most of the response was quite enthusiastic and supportive of the overall initiative and of the general emerging direction of the taxonomy. But we need to also be really clear that we heard a healthy amount of skepticism, and that there are some who really feel it's rather implausible to try and implement a standardized data collection system, especially when you think about longitudinal national data over time, this being something that could really be carried out. Though we're not hearing any encouragement to abandon ship at this point. We're hearing lots of encouragement to try and find the right way forward. And I think what Alan alluded to is what we heard quite clearly, that the easiest place for most, all of you to start is at that level, at the funder level, the funder provider level. The type of information indicated in the taxonomy feels quite doable. It feels like something that's not onerous and that you could probably pretty easily put together. Many also feel that as well about the program level. Once we get down to the award and recipient level, that's where we start to see a lot more differences of opinion. And that involves, of course, things around demographic information, issues around career stage, especially in ways to characterize that, become much more nuanced, and each of you has a different way you've navigated that. And at the same time, even some of the feedback which indicated that this was sort of the greatest minefield, at the same time often said this is also the area that may be the most valuable. So we see sort of a push-pull between the desire for that kind of information, who's receiving the grants, has that really played out in the way we expected? So that trepidation and desire are kind of mixed in that zone. So some of the other elements are there's concern, especially about the administrative burden around the award recipient level. Some of you are collecting that, but many of you are not collecting as much information at that level. There also, as Alan mentioned, this issue of the funder's intent is something that really keeps coming forward over and over again, and the interest in gathering information about that. The practices that are being used in terms of fulfilling the intent. How does intent, how is that reflected in type of practice? And then the issue of monetary and non-monetary support, which goes back to the egg diagram, where we first really were trying to wrestle with that sort of very slippery area in some cases, because they're often joined together in ways that are not easily tracked. But there's an interest in what the synergy is between those various pieces and trying to understand more of that. And some of these, of course, the question of whether that's something that can be defined more quantitatively or qualitatively keeps emerging. There also is some concern with small foundations that within the quantitative data approach, that their work will just appear as a mere rounding error. That this is something that really, no matter how innovative or how dynamic the work is, that if you're looking purely in counting, that you're not really getting the nuance of that. And as Cindy mentioned today, earlier, this issue around panel process or selection process, in some cases, some of you are really seeing that very much as being an intentional form of artist support, whereas others see it as a means to an end and have not necessarily thought about it in quite the same ways. And so there's some question about how to capture and examine that issue, along with all the questions related to eligibility for grants, everything from whether it's nominated, self-selected, competitive, all those different dimensions. So the complexity that we also saw, not too surprisingly, is around the very concept of individual artists. How do we handle artists' collectives? How do we handle situations about founder-led companies? So where still the individual artist is really at the core of that. And some of you also make grants to nonprofits very much with the intent of supporting the individual artist. And yet that form of trickle-down can sometimes not be adequately captured, and we're concerned that we find the right way to make sure that that is also part of the picture. So especially when that relates to issues like commissioning of new works, some social practice and community-based work, and also things like exhibitions and publications. There are a number of different ways where sometimes that plays out. So first, as we talk about moving the taxonomy forward, we should make clear that the current version that you're all having access to has not been changed from the one that those of you who reviewed it for interviews saw. That is still in its same form. And in part, it is what we're hearing through this conference period, and also as we continue to vet it, that we're going to move towards, by the end of the year is our goal, that we will have another version that will, hopefully a finalized version of the taxonomy, though we know that there's going to be all kinds of dimensions of this that will continue to be worthy of a lot of conversation. And I would just add that I think what also came out around this desire that certain pieces of it, the parts that are around recipient, discipline issues, career issues, there are a number of you who are hungry to implement a standard that's somewhere out there. And so there's some interest in that. So various pieces of this are being awaited in very different ways among the folks in this room. So, so we'll just keep moving towards that to end of the year with the newest and greatest version of this. So I'm going to pass it back to Alan.
Thanks, Claudia. So we're going to do an exercise in just a few minutes. We're going to pass out a survey. Of course, we're going to pass out a survey, and you're going to take it. And you're not going to get lunch until you take it. No, you're going to help us essentially prioritize issues. But before we do that, first of all, as Claudia mentioned, we're still gathering input. So those of you who haven't seen the taxonomy, we decided not to pass it out in hard copy today, mostly to save trees, but also just because it's dense and it takes time, and we didn't want to put anyone on the spot, to actually be flipping through this data taxonomy in this session. But we're happy. I'm here, Claudia here through the whole conference. If any of you would like to approach us, we'll book a time to talk. We'd love to get input from all of you on this while it's still in the oven. A number of you in our conversations volunteered to be pilot sites for an implementation, our first wave of data collection, which is great. Thank you very much. But rather than focus your attention on the details of the taxonomy, we don't think that's advisable in this setting. But I'd like to engage you in another more important conversation. In our discussions with you, we were asked time and time again to re-articulate, why are we doing this? What is the outcome? Your funders, you're very well trained to focus on outcomes. And what is the benefit to me if I cooperate with this? And there's also some general concern about the long timeline of this work, and there's concern that it won't yield useful information fast enough. So, complexity is the challenge of this initiative, managing complexity, and the only way of managing that is for us to be laser-like clear about why are we doing this. And I don't mean to suggest that the initiative has been lacking a purpose. That's not true. It's always been rooted in a strong sense of need amongst a cohort of GIA members for data that paints this sort of picture of the landscape. The the Foundation Center's report is in the recent issue of Reader, and there's an example of a benchmarking system that's in place, it's humming, and a number of you made analogies to that. Are we doing that? Why and what is the benefit? So I want to question the assumption that more data is better. We live in a society where we're inundated with information, and our capacity to absorb more information is extremely limited, just as humans. So what we really want to do here, as several of you reminded us, is to collect just enough data to allow for the conversations that we really want to have as a field. And that sort of notion of economy of data collection. Let's just collect enough data. So, in a funny way, getting into this taxonomy has kind of allowed us to see the forest for the trees in a funny way. And we've circled all the way back in our thinking to reconsidering what is this all about? Because we very much started out thinking, we're going to install this longitudinal data collection system that's going to produce all this great data about support for individual artists. And we've in developing the taxonomy, we've had some epiphanies. So I just want to say research necessarily begins with a question, not a methodology. But it's hard to fight that. Research questions, however, are not always apparent at first, and sometimes they reveal themselves in stages. So in reality, developing the methodology, the taxonomy that we've done, has brought new clarity to the underlying questions. So in fact, new research questions grew out of our conversations with many of you, like the whole matter of panel processes and eligibility criteria. That wasn't on our radar map before we spoke to you. So we have really full circle come back to purpose. And the survey that you've got is an exercise in revisiting what this whole initiative could yield and kind of getting a sense of your priorities for issues. So we're going to go into an exercise. I'll just walk you through this survey briefly, and then I'll ask you all to work quietly for maybe 5 or 6 minutes to actually go through it. But I want to say there's a core set of research questions around the ecology, sort of characterizing the ecology of artist support, that are for the moment are assumed. And we're not going to get into the weeds about these questions, but how much support is going to artists? Is it rising or falling? What kinds of approaches are being used by fundraisers to support artists? There's a core level of research questions that we're not debating at this point because we are assuming still that there's some level of longitudinal data collection that will be put in place. But kind of around that, there's very much an open question as to what are the topics or issues or research questions that we really want to bring forward. Because some of the data that would inform those questions might not necessarily come out of a quantitative survey, but might come out of more qualitative research, case studies, and so forth. So there's a list of 12 topics and questions underneath them in your survey. And we are asking you to assign them a rating of 1, 2, or 3, with 1 being, this is my top priority for my organization, 2 being, this is interesting but not hugely important, and 3 being, this is not a major. And you can assign as many 1s, 2s, and 3s as you want, but please don't mark them all as 1, that won't be helpful to us, or all as 3, or I suppose you can. And feel free to make notes. We are going to collect these, and we're going to really look very closely. And feel free to scribble in the margin, or circle things, or make comments and questions on the last page. Are there any questions about this form before we break? Yes?
Well, I can answer this myself.
Yeah?
Or I can try and answer it on behalf of the foundation. Is there
I
one
see.
direction or the other you would prefer me and others to go in?
Sure. I would propose you answer on behalf of your foundation. You could also answer it on behalf of the field, which you might have different answers, but we'll get to that later. Yes?
I just have a quick, I hope, question. In your chart, when we're using the word direct support,
Mm-hmm.
is it funder directly to individual artists only? The only intermediary on the right, and if we use the word direct support to individuals, it's what the funder is getting directly to an artist, or is it through an intermediary?
The question was whether direct support means only that the money is going directly from the bank account of the funder directly to the bank account of the individual artist. And in this taxonomy, that is not the only way that it's being defined. It's being defined that if a funder has, if a source has indicated the specific artist for whom the money is intended, even if it goes to a fiscal agent or through some other entity, then that is still considered direct support. So it's basically in this model at this point, the assumption is if an individual artist, in other words, if the selection process still has sat with the foundation, it's considered direct support. There could be some other entity for any number of reasons that might be handling the money on its pathway. So that's the way it sits at this point in the taxonomy. Is that?
Okay.
If there's a key topic missing, can you put that in the
If there's a key topic missing, please add it under the comments and questions section, please. Jason.
So I don't want to make this any more complicated than it's already. I am curious about, in terms of the issues around crowdfunding, if we're thinking about or using crowdfunding in terms of direct support to artists.
At this point, do you want to answer that one?
It came up. It absolutely came up as an emerging part of this ecology. And some of you are involved in leveraging your funds through crowdfunding resources. So if you think that's an important topic, add it. Add it.
Just one comment. I wondered about if in the aid model, if crowdfunding needs to be identified in some particular way, because it just doesn't seem that whole kind of mode or that form of support. I don't know that it got captured, so that's what made me ask the question.
Sure.
Actually, what's interesting about that, Jason, is that when we did this a year ago, there were not as many institutional funders who had made it part of their portfolio of tools. And so in just the year since we did that, in a sense, the role of funders as being connected to that has changed.
I don't want to interrupt your filling out your form, but Jason, that did remind me, and I'll just let you know that GIA is working with Kickstarter on a study, and Kickstarter has agreed to open up their data to us, and we hope to publish something in 2014 cooperatively about their art support to substantiate their claims in the kind of language that the field uses.
Okay. We're just going to give you a few minutes to work quietly. When you're finished, hold on to your forms, and we'll have a discussion about your answers, and then we'll collect them at the end.
Would it be helpful if people are proposing new topics that we all write it down and that we all vote on it? So that, because how else are you going to prioritize that?
Yeah. We will continue to get input on top priorities, and if there is support for a new topic when it's discussed later, let's hear it.
working with Kickstarter on a study, and Kickstarter has agreed to open up their data to us, and we hope to publish something in 2014 cooperatively about their art support to substantiate their claims in the kind of language that the field uses.
Just going to give you a few minutes to work quietly. About 2 more minutes. Okay, I see several of you are still finishing up, but in the interest of keeping everyone alive, we're going to keep going here. So I'm going to ask essentially 3 questions. One is kind of this is our conceptualization of 12 topics, but there's any way they could be reconfigured. Are there any topics that you felt particularly passionate about? That's question number 1. 2, are there topics that should be combined or expanded? And 3, are there any missing topics or questions? So that's the discussion I'd like to have now. I'm going to stand while we have this. And I just want to take volunteers, and if we don't get volunteers, I'll call on you randomly to say what jumped out of you. What are you what's the fire in your belly in terms of the topics that you read? Who would like to start? Sir.
Tony Grant.
Hey, Tony.
So I gave this feedback to you during our interview, and I just wanted to call it out now. Topic number 1, the equity of support, and relating just the question in there, do awardees look like applicants? And the important suggestion there is that we're not just collecting data about recipients, but we're collecting data about applicants as well. And to me, I think that's critical because I don't see how else we can make that connection.
That's great. I'll pass the mic to the woman in front of you.
Building on that, Lena Carson, City of Atlanta, we're one of the only municipalities that gives money directly to artists. And so we are spending more and more time focusing on increasing our applicant pool for that same reason. We made that a top priority last year for our grant cycle, increased our number of applications 3 times over. This year we focused on getting more community organizations that maybe had an arts program, and what we didn't think about is that our number of individual artist applications dropped right back down to where they were the year before. So we're now realizing just how labor intensive it is to increase the applicant pool or even retain the applicant pool year after year after year so that these programs that are already in, I have money that I need to give to artists and I
Uh-huh.
can't get them to apply.
That's great. Thank you for that. Any more comments on that? Sure.
I would also say that if we are collecting information on the demographics of the applicants and the awardees, we should also collect information on the panelists involved in that process.
Oh, interesting. Uh-huh.
Because we have found in our work that the demographic composition of the panelists has an impact on the demographic composition of the awardees.
Great comment. Thank you. Ben?
I'm happy to fill this out if you told me I did it wrong. So I just want to acknowledge this. I realized in filling this out that there was a difference between what I need at my foundation versus what I think we need as a field.
Right.
And so hearing your instruction, there were things I think we need to measure as a field that because they're givens at my foundation, like use of intermediaries, I thought, come hell or high water, that's just the way we have to operate because of the board's restrictions. So I don't need to know that. So it's a much lower thing than if you ask me what's important for the field. If you'd rather me fill it out according to the what's important for the field, I'm happy to redo mine.
Now, what it was important to you, Ben? What did you mark? Okay. All right, that's all right. I don't want to put you on the spot. Who else? Yes, MK?
What I think is missing would be the topic that was raised this morning about adequate compensation for artists walking away with the equivalent of a living wage in their pockets, and how you get at that through these priorities.
Okay. Great. Any others of you? What jumped out? What is kind of your top priorities? Yes.
So I have two comments. The first one is that there was a nice convergence for topic number one, talking about equity and building on what Anne was saying, and the panel selection process and eligibility criteria. There's a convergence in terms of those priorities. And then my second one had to do with missing topics, and this is the idea of defining the market in terms of what our field is and how we collect data.
Just defining our field. Or the market for artists' work? Okay. Interesting. All right. Let's hear from some others of you who've not. What are some, yes?
I was just, maybe it's there, but I didn't see it, is what sorts of awards and grants, dollar amounts are being given. I think it's underlying everything, but that wasn't, I couldn't say how important that was to me.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's in the list of assumed questions right now.
But you assume number one for everybody?
Well, there's a certain number of questions that will sort of come with the territory of doing a benchmarking study, and that's one of them. Yes?
Oops. So this isn't fully cooked, but kind of around that area around career stage, I think the underlying logic is that depending on where you are in your process, you may need different kinds of support. I think the same is true with the way that you work, right? So again, going back to that social practice piece, that's a completely different ecology of support that's required than if you are creating a new dance or if you're creating a film, et cetera. And so I don't know what the specific questions are, but how do we kind of unpack the kind of support that's required depending on the genre?
That's great. Thank you so much. Yes?
Heather Pontonio with the Emily Hall Tremaine Foundation, and we focus on providing professional practice training programs for artists. And so I think within topic 12, that non-monetary support, it's an alumni question in a lot of ways. So how to keep in touch with artists you're not directly working with anymore. In order to get that, you need to look sometimes 5-10 years down the road.
Yeah, several of you in our interviews talked about engaging alumni in some very creative ways.
Lauren Shenfield with Anonymous was a woman. This may be in your baseline also, but I'm interested in the administrative costs in relation to number and size and amount of grants.
Can I just have a rough show of hands? How many of you are interested in kind of overhead, issues related to overhead? A couple of you? It'll come through on the survey, about 10 or 12. That's great. Yes, Karen.
Thank you. I found the topic of eligibility criteria really important to us. In San Jose, we're now expanding our eligibility to arts-based businesses, which are very in large part led by artists. So it's artists as manufacturers that might have one or more employees. So I found that's a kind of new area of work for us. So I'd like to see where the field is going.
Thank you. Thank you.
I also wanted to add to equity of support for topic number one. It seems that we need to know the demographics of the region in which the grants are given out. Because if I live in a 40% Latino city and the applicant pool doesn't reflect that, then I can't make up the difference in giving awards to Latinos that haven't applied. So the only way I can wrestle with that full equity issue is if you're also capturing the demographics of my city.
Roberto?
I piggyback on the question about social practice, which is a term I despise, and that's another story. But when you support engagement work, it's what's really important in terms of criteria is like what the partner is, how you deal with it, how do you deal with the professional development of artists who are doing community work, which falls in my court. And then I evaluate not just the project itself, but the relationship. So how do we clock and try to get a glimpse of what this growing world of engagement practices are looking like? It's going to be messy, for sure.
I just have a question about topic 7, and my question is this a euphemism for performing arts companies, producing companies? Because they're really not, and I use specifically ensemble practice, but this seems very heavily weighted toward the solo artists working independently. And in the performing arts, of course, it's a collaborative art form by nature.
So you would advocate for more
Inclusive language around the performing arts.
Okay, great. Pass the mic behind.
So I think it belongs in number 1. We're talking about collecting demographics on panelists and all that, and I think it's really important. People have mentioned it here a few times. As an outsider listening, is this issue of the board and what your board looks like. It sounds like defines maybe what you can and cannot do. I feel like people are hinting at that, but not actually saying it. And so I think for you as a group to understand these people are gatekeepers, right? Ultimately responsible for the decisions you make as an institution, it would be great, I think, to be able to see across the board what those groups look like, what that pool is. So this thinking about engagement from across the institution on a continuum.
Caitlin Storkosh from the Alliance of Artist Communities. I just had a question about how you might be capturing support for artists that's coming from something other than the arts portfolio within a foundation. So if there are artists, for example, that are working as part of a team that's doing an environmental project and that's coming from the kind of environmental portfolio within a foundation, if there's a way that you're thinking about trying to capture that support for individual artists as well. You need more work to do.
It's getting more and more complicated by the minute. That's great. Other reactions to this list? What's not on it? Yes, here's your chance.
Something that's come to mind is how we would capture how support is utilized by artists in terms of, specifically how they're using it. And in some cases, it could be for tools or resources or to build space or time or whatever it is, but going back and looking at the draft taxonomy and what we're doing now, I'm not sure how that's captured.
Is that question germane to unrestricted support or restricted support or both?
Well, I think it's both. So just in my mind, I kind of think, how do we understand how artists generally use support? How are, which is broad, but I don't know if you could categorize that kind of thing?
It's a big question. Yes.
Hi. Since all this data collection is about accountability and effectiveness, I noticed there were 3 questions in there that really were going towards trusting artists with their work. And so I'm coming back from, again, the interviews I did with artists recently, so this is not from an institutional point of view. But there's longitudinal support, the restricted versus unrestricted support, and then the new work that's not necessarily project-based. So all those would be areas of support that really rely on trusting artists with maybe larger amounts of money over longer times, where the outcomes are open and playful. And that might be grouped together in a way as something that's actually running counter to the data collection and being very important.
I'm not quite fully understanding your point, and I think it's very important. So would you maybe expand on that, or someone else who has a similar? But I love the word playfulness that you said. That is what kind of support allows artists to be.
I can actually say something really quickly about it that might illustrate it. I'm just coming off of a sabbatical. As an academic, I have access to that. So what about thinking about supports that are giving people sabbaticals? As an academic, you get them after you have been vetted, but it's a large amount of trust that's placed into you. So I'm really interested in this dichotomy between trusting artists with their work, which is something that post the 80s has eroded, and at the same time thinking about data collection and effectiveness, which is coming so much from a different perspective. So how can these things fit together? So it's a systemic question.
That's helpful. Thanks. Ben?
In the interest of, no, sorry. It's just interesting to me looking at this model that we get down to the bottom and it says award and recipient info and there's no information coming out of it. You know what I mean? It's like we get down to the artist, but we're not asking them anything or interested in anything they'd have to tell us. And I guess maybe this can't do that, but remembering Cindy's analogy this morning about the spokes of the wheel, I mean, we're really trying to create a stable wheel that will make the bicycle go forward. And part of me wonders if we're just sort of measuring one spoke with no way to understand if the spoke is a short spoke flapping in the wind or if it's useful. You know what I mean?
Right. Well, this is one of the limitations of this project is that we're looking at the supply of support. We're not looking at the demand. We're not asking artists what kind of support do you need. Link did that for quite a while and did a very good job of that. So we're not, anyway, and it just opens up a Pandora's box of research questions.
And I guess what I mean about the spoke is within the mix of what you do as an artist, is the funding world a long spoke for you or is it a short spoke for you? And is it getting shorter all the time? And I mean, the kind of thing, and maybe I'm thinking about this because we're in Philly with CDP, you know what I mean? And part of the usefulness of that data is understanding the system and seeing where your funding feeds the system. It's probably not the purpose of this. I just think it's a really interesting analysis of our piece, but there's nothing in this that helps me understand the larger system.
Okay, good. All right, who else would like to express their, sorry? Okay, great.
Hi, Alan. Tatiana Hernandez of the Knight Foundation. So, like Risa, I don't know that this is fully cooked, but 2 thoughts around the proposal itself, what kinds of questions we're asking of artists in the proposals process, and the review process. What are we looking at in terms of validating measures for artists? And I think both of those can end up falling under equity and some of the questions around that, but I was just curious. I'd be curious what other people are doing in that space.
Huh? Right, is the application as an instrument of inclusiveness or exclusiveness. That's great. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Hi, Vinnie Murphy with the Tana Foundation. The one that jumped out at me this time was the eligibility question. And that's partly as an artist working in Atlanta, but also a trustee for a foundation in Boston. Who gets in and even more importantly to me lately, because I teach at a university where we have a very grand mission statement, but we rarely live up to it. So in terms of the eligibility and where the trickle down is, it's, you know, to measure somehow what your mission statement is versus who you actually give the money to. And I think there's some profound disconnect, at least at my university there is. And there is for us at the TANA Foundation, because we talked about underserved communities. It's a lip service thing that we do, right? It's an important part of our mission, but we don't actually meet it. So if you look where the money goes, that's not where the money goes.
Interesting. I'm hearing a lot of interest around applicants and eligibility and equity around that. Yep. Great. Anyone else want to? Marion?
Marion Godfrey, I have more of a kind of a process comment and a contextualization comment, which is that I think it, and I know you're thinking about this, I think it will be helpful as this process goes along to articulate how and when this data can be linked with other data from outside sources, such as the demographic data, which this project can't collect, but which is easily available online. And when this kind of data needs to be collected with more qualitative, or connected with more qualitative research. I mean, I think there's a huge amount of qualitative research or, you know, case studies that could be done about panel selection, use of intermediaries, all that. I don't know what you're thinking about with intermediaries, that would really enrich this, where it's probably not necessarily that easy to collect the data itself. So I just want to honor that this project is going to work when it combines what it can do itself with what other people are already doing or could be doing.
Pick up on Ben's comment about applicants, because for me, I think I said this last year too, if some basic questions for applicants could begin to be started in this process, it seems to me it would be a way of starting the whole idea that this is an important piece of trying to get baseline data for artists in general. The lack of that within the CDP component says we're really not looking at that. But I think could be some common stuff that this sector, the grant-making sector, might agree with. And I think it would start the idea that we really got to develop this. I mean, it's a second part of this study, but it could be a catalyst for something larger. Go ahead.
My understanding for what you're looking at in this study is it does not include commissions or other income to artists, maybe through teaching or other. Someone raised looking at it also commercially. And so if you could talk a little bit about where you feel it would be a different study or what you can't cover through this. And also Ben's comment about how this is set up and what you're getting out of the awardees, the recipients for information. I would love to see this in a format that's not so hierarchical, that funders are not at the top.
That's great. Thank you. We've heard that from others. It's very helpful. Tomer, would you respond to the question about what's not, kind of where are the boundaries and why sort of artists' income from other sources would not be covered in this?
Yeah, and I think we talked about this a little bit last year, but I'd go back to our purpose is that GIA is an organization that serves funders to serve their practice. So our focus in the work has always been to, as our first level of data information, to try and capture a picture of what the funding community is doing. And one of the things that we have learned, of which, salaries and teaching positions and food stamps, there is this amazing range where artists overlap with the general population, that it's probably important, but it may be beyond the scope of this study. And one of the things we've accumulated, I think, sort of separately and aren't on your priority list, is that a number of these other sources of support have been identified for us. So I think what we have is an opportunity there for future work, whether it's by this organization or by someone else, to look at that. And I would only say that one of the other factor that tempers that is simply the capacity of what we can possibly do. even where we started is proving to be a little bit of a challenge here, but it is important information. So.
That's great. If there are any other comments? Thank you for that. I know this wasn't easy. If you would pass your surveys over to this side of the room, and John will collect them up. I just would close by saying our role here is one of facilitation and advancing the conceptualization of this initiative. And you are keeping us very honest by giving us very candid feedback, and that very much needs to continue. The appetite for data is your eyes are bigger than your stomach, and we very much have to temper this. And I'd like to think what's happening here is that you are setting an agenda for your field about what you want to talk about. And that is marvelous if it would be an outcome of this, that the data collection element of this would just be a platform for having the conversations about substantive core issues about your practice and about what is keeping your field from reaching its next level of effectiveness. That's what this is really all about. So let's not get obsessed with data and taxonomies. That's all happening. But let's keep these issues. What do you really want to talk about as a field that will advance your work and bring others into the work to propel the work forward? So we will take all of your input under advisement. And we will produce a revised taxonomy. And in fact, we'll be working with GIA. Our last bit of work is to help GIA figure out sort of how to move forward with this in a practical way, kind of what implementation looks like and what partners might come to the table to work with GIA in making this all fruitful. So Tomer, you want to wrap up?
Thank you, Alan and Claudia and John, for your work here. I was just going to say one last thing about next steps. Is our goal here is to continue to seek input on this taxonomy and this process. Ellen and Claudia and John will all be at the conference here for the next couple of days. So if you want to try and nab them at any point to have a further discussion, or myself, I'm a little more difficult to track down during the conference, so you have better luck with these folks. They're here just for that purpose, to join you at lunch or for coffee, or catch them in the hallway. We're interested, or email us or contact us afterwards if other ideas come out. Our goal is to finalize this taxonomy, deliver it back to the field after the first of the year, and we haven't set a specific agenda, but we hope to be presenting that at a number of other meetings as we move forward. And there are people who've expressed interest in immediately implementing some parts of this into their own practice and start gathering data. I think, as Alan mentions, probably one of the bigger uses is simply that it's going to provide a common vocabulary as these conversations move forward that will maybe get us to more coherent discussion and a little less sort of Tower of Babylon that has sometimes occurred in these discussions. That's probably an extreme example. But, so we look forward to your continuing support. We're going to have a break now.